Margaret Thompson clutched her walking cane tighter as she spotted the muscular dog approaching down Maple Street. At 78 years old, she had developed an unfortunate habit of crossing to the other side of the road whenever she saw certain breeds of dogs. Pit bulls in particular sent waves of anxiety through her frail frame. The media stories, the neighborhood gossip, and decades of fear had built an impenetrable wall in her mind against these animals. Her small brick house on the corner had been her sanctuary for 43 years. After losing her husband Edward 2 years ago, Margaret had become increasingly isolated, venturing out only for essential errands and her weekly grocery shopping. The quiet neighborhood had changed over the years, with younger families moving in, bringing with them pets that Margaret viewed with suspicion and worry. The morning routine was always the same. Margaret would peek through her lace curtains at exactly 7:30, checking for any dogs in the vicinity before stepping outside to collect her newspaper. Her arthritic hands would fumble with the locks, and she would quickly shuffle to the end of her driveway, eyes scanning left and right for any four-legged threats. The simple task of retrieving her morning paper had become a military operation, planned with precision and executed with caution. Mrs. Henderson from 3 houses down had recently adopted what she called a rescue dog, but Margaret had seen the animal during one of her cautious window observations. It was clearly a pit bull with its broad head, muscular build, and intimidating presence. The sight of it had kept Margaret awake several nights, worrying about her safety during her daily walks to the mailbox. Her daughter Sarah called every Sunday, always encouraging her mother to be more social, to maybe join the community center activities or take walks around the neighborhood for exercise. "Mom, you can't live in fear," Sarah would say during their weekly conversations. But Sarah lived 3 states away and didn't understand the reality of Margaret's daily concerns. She didn't see the dogs that roamed the neighborhood, didn't hear the stories that circulated among the elderly residents about attacks and incidents. Margaret's fear wasn't entirely unfounded in her mind. She remembered reading news articles about pit bull attacks, stories that had been seared into her memory over the years. Each headline had reinforced her belief that these animals were dangerous, unpredictable creatures that posed a threat to innocent people like herself. The statistics and sensationalized reports had created a mental barrier that seemed impossible to overcome. The local grocery store had become her primary source of social interaction. Margaret would chat briefly with the cashiers, always mentioning her concerns about the neighborhood dogs when the conversation turned to local happenings. The young employees would nod politely, but she could see in their eyes that they didn't truly understand her perspective. They were young, fearless, and hadn't lived through decades of accumulated worry like she had. Her neighbor to the right, Mr. Peterson, had tried to reassure her on several occasions. He was a retired veterinarian who had worked with all breeds of dogs throughout his career. "Margaret," he would say over the fence that separated their properties, "dogs are usually a reflection of their owners. A well-trained, well-loved dog is rarely a problem, regardless of breed." But his professional opinion couldn't penetrate the fortress of fear that Margaret had built around herself. The insurance agent had called the previous month, discussing her homeowner's policy. During the conversation, he had mentioned something about certain dog breeds affecting coverage, which only reinforced Margaret's beliefs about the dangers these animals posed. If insurance companies were concerned about pit bulls, surely her fears were justified, she reasoned. Margaret's daily routine had become increasingly restrictive. She would only venture outside during specific hours, when she knew most dogs would be indoors. Her grocery shopping was scheduled for early morning when fewer people were out walking their pets. Even her visits to the doctor required careful planning and timing to avoid potential encounters with dogs that might frighten her. The loneliness was becoming overwhelming, but the fear was stronger. Margaret would sit in her living room during the evening hours, watching television programs about home invasions and local crime, further reinforcing her need to stay vigilant and protected. The world outside her door seemed filled with potential threats, and dogs represented just one of many dangers she believed she faced as an elderly woman living alone. Her late husband Edward had always been the brave one, the protector who would handle any situation that arose. He had been fond of animals, often stopping to pet neighborhood dogs during their walks together. Margaret missed his calm presence, his ability to make her feel safe in situations that now terrified her. Without him, every challenge seemed magnified, Every potential threat loomed larger. The medicine cabinet in her bathroom contained bottles of anxiety medication prescribed by her doctor, but Margaret was reluctant to take them regularly. She preferred to manage her fears through avoidance and careful planning, rather than relying on pills that might dull her alertness. She believed that staying sharp and aware was essential for her survival in what she perceived as an increasingly dangerous world. Sleep had become elusive, particularly on nights when she heard dogs barking in the distance. Margaret would lie in bed listening to every sound, imagining scenarios where aggressive dogs might somehow breach her property. The rational part of her mind knew these fears were likely exaggerated, but the emotional response was too strong to overcome with logic alone. Her small circle of elderly friends shared similar concerns, and their coffee gatherings often centered around discussions of neighborhood safety and the problems they perceived with younger residents who owned large dogs. These conversations reinforced Margaret's beliefs and provided validation for her fears, creating an echo chamber that made it even more difficult for her to consider alternative perspectives. The beautiful autumn morning when everything would change was still weeks away. Margaret had no way of knowing that her carefully constructed world of fear and isolation was about to be challenged in the most unexpected way. A chance encounter was approaching that would force her to confront not only her fears about pit bulls, but also her assumptions about the nature of courage, friendship, and the unexpected places where love can be found. For now, she continued her routine of cautious living, unaware that her life was about to be transformed by a four-legged teacher who would show her that sometimes the things we fear most are exactly what we need to heal our hearts and rediscover our capacity for trust and joy. The moving truck arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning in October, rumbling down Maple Street like a mechanical beast disturbing the usual quiet of the neighborhood. Margaret watched from behind her curtains as workers unloaded furniture and boxes at the house directly across from hers. The previous owners, an elderly couple like herself, had moved to a retirement community the month before, leaving the modest two-story home empty for several weeks. A young woman emerged from a small sedan, directing the movers with confident gestures. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with shoulder-length brown hair and a warm smile that seemed to light up her entire face. Margaret observed from her hidden vantage point, noting the woman's casual clothes and friendly demeanor as she chatted with the moving crew. At least she seemed pleasant enough, Margaret thought, though she remained cautious about any changes to her familiar surroundings. The moving process continued throughout the day, and Margaret found herself returning to the window periodically, curious despite her natural tendency toward privacy. The new neighbor appeared to be single, with no sign of a husband or children among the belongings being carried into the house. Margaret wondered what would bring such a young woman to this quiet street, filled mostly with retirees and established families. As evening approached, Margaret was preparing her simple dinner when she heard a car door slam across the street. Peering through the kitchen window, she saw her new neighbor opening the back of a small SUV. What happened next made Margaret's blood run cold. A large, muscular dog jumped out of the vehicle, its powerful frame immediately recognizable as the breed she feared most. The pit bull was brown and white with a broad head and the intimidating build that had featured in so many of her nightmares. Margaret dropped her teacup, the porcelain shattering on her kitchen floor as she backed away from the window. Her heart began racing and her hands started trembling uncontrollably. The very thing she had dreaded was now living directly across the street, just yards from her front door. All her careful routines, her strategic timing for outdoor activities, her sense of security in her own neighborhood, everything was suddenly threatened by this unwelcome development. She spent the next hour cleaning up the broken cup, her mind racing with worried thoughts. How could she continue her daily routine with that dangerous animal so close to her home? What if it escaped from its yard? What if it became aggressive toward other neighborhood pets or worse, toward elderly residents like herself? The questions multiplied in her mind, each one adding to her growing anxiety about this unwelcome change to her environment. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound from across the street sent waves of panic through Margaret's nervous system. She heard the dog barking a few times, each bark confirming her worst fears about having such a creature in close proximity to her home. She imagined scenarios where the animal might break free from its constraints and threaten her safety during her morning newspaper routine or her weekly trips to the mailbox. The next morning brought no relief. Margaret's usual 7:30 newspaper retrieval was postponed as she watched through her curtains, waiting to see if the dog would appear in the front yard. She saw her new neighbor, who appeared to be preparing for work, loading items into her car. The woman seemed oblivious to the fear she had inadvertently introduced to the neighborhood with her choice of pet. Margaret called her daughter Sarah that evening, unable to contain her distress about the new development. "There's a pit bull living across the street now," she announced without preamble when Sarah answered the phone. "I don't know what I'm going to do. I can't even get my newspaper safely anymore." Sarah listened patiently, offering the same reassurances she always provided. But Margaret could hear the slight frustration in her daughter's voice as she suggested that maybe this was an opportunity to overcome her fears. The following day, Margaret ventured to call Mrs. Henderson, hoping to find a sympathetic ear for her concerns. However, Mrs. Henderson's response was unexpected. "Oh, you must mean Lisa," she said cheerfully. "I met her yesterday evening. She seems lovely, and that dog of hers is absolutely precious. His name is Wally, and he's so gentle and well-behaved. Lisa told me he's a therapy dog in training." A therapy dog? Margaret couldn't process this information. How could a pit bull, a breed she knew to be aggressive and dangerous, possibly be trained as a therapy animal? Mrs. Henderson must be mistaken or perhaps too trusting of her new neighbor's claims. Margaret had read enough news stories to know that pit bulls were responsible for numerous attacks, regardless of any supposed training they might have received. Over the next few days, Margaret's world became even more restricted. She would wait until she was absolutely certain the coast was clear before venturing outside, even for the briefest errands. Her grocery shopping was rescheduled to different times, and she found herself taking circuitous routes to her car to avoid any possibility of encountering the dog or its owner. From her window observations, Margaret began to notice patterns in her neighbor's routine. Lisa appeared to leave for work around 8:15 each morning and return around 6 in the evening. The dog seemed to accompany her sometimes, leading Margaret to wonder if it traveled in the car with her. The thought of that powerful animal being mobile throughout the neighborhood only added to her growing list of worries. Margaret also noticed that Lisa spent time in her backyard each evening, apparently playing with or training the dog. Even from a distance, she could see the animal's size and muscular build, confirming all her preconceived notions about the potential danger it represented. The fact that it appeared to be obedient to its owner provided little comfort to Margaret, who had convinced herself that pit bulls were inherently unpredictable and could turn aggressive without warning. The isolation was becoming more pronounced. Margaret found herself declining even her few social activities, worried about encountering the dog during her travels around the neighborhood. Her weekly visit to the community center was canceled, and she began having her groceries delivered rather than risk the journey to the store. Mr. Peterson, her veterinarian neighbor, attempted to engage her in conversation over the fence one afternoon. "I see we have a new neighbor with a beautiful pit bull," he commented casually. "I've met both Lisa and Wally. They're wonderful additions to our street." Margaret listened politely but couldn't bring herself to share his positive assessment. In her mind, he was being dangerously naive about the potential risks. The changing leaves and cooling temperatures of autumn usually brought Margaret joy, as it was her favorite season for sitting on her small front porch and watching the world go by. This year, however, even that simple pleasure was denied to her by the presence of the dog across the street. Her world was shrinking day by day, confined increasingly to the interior of her home where she felt safe from the perceived threat that had invaded her peaceful neighborhood. Margaret had no way of knowing that across the street, Lisa was equally aware of her elderly neighbor's fear and was already formulating a plan to help bridge the gap between them. The young woman had noticed Margaret's curtain movements and her carefully timed outdoor activities, recognizing the signs of someone who was genuinely frightened. Lisa understood that her beloved Wally would need to prove himself to this scared neighbor, and she was determined to find a way to make that happen safely and gently. 3 weeks had passed since Lisa and Wally moved to Maple Street, and Margaret's routine had become even more rigid and restrictive. She had developed an intricate system of checking multiple windows before venturing outside, ensuring that neither the dog nor its owner were visible anywhere in the vicinity. Her morning newspaper collection now required a 15-minute surveillance operation, followed by a quick dash to the driveway and an equally hasty retreat to the safety of her home. The first direct encounter came on a gray Thursday morning when Margaret's careful timing failed her. She had observed the street for her usual period, and seeing no signs of activity, decided it was safe to retrieve her newspaper and check her mailbox. However, as she was returning from the mailbox with a handful of bills and advertisements, she heard the unmistakable sound of a car door closing across the street. Frozen in terror, Margaret watched as Lisa emerged from her vehicle, followed immediately by the massive pit bull she had been dreading. Wally jumped down from the car with athletic grace, his muscular frame even more intimidating up close than it had appeared from her window observations. Margaret's heart began pounding so violently she was certain it would burst from her chest. Her legs felt weak and she gripped her walking cane with both hands, using it for support as much as protection. Lisa noticed Margaret immediately and raised her hand in a friendly wave. "Good morning," she called out cheerfully, apparently oblivious to the elderly woman's obvious distress. "I'm Lisa, your new neighbor. I've been hoping to introduce myself." Wally sat obediently beside his owner, his tongue hanging out in what appeared to be a friendly expression, but which Margaret interpreted as a sign of barely controlled aggression. Margaret managed a weak nod but found herself unable to speak. She began backing toward her front door, never taking her eyes off the dog. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as she had read somewhere that sudden motions could trigger an attack from aggressive animals. Every step felt like an eternity, and she was acutely aware of the distance between herself and the safety of her home. "This is Wally," Lisa continued, seemingly unaware of Margaret's terror. She placed a gentle hand on the dog's head, and Margaret noticed how the animal remained perfectly still, showing no signs of the unpredictable behavior she had expected. "He's very friendly and loves meeting new people. We're both excited to be part of this neighborhood." The words barely registered in Margaret's panic-stricken mind. All she could focus on was the dog's size, the power evident in its muscular build, and her desperate need to reach her front door. She fumbled with her keys, her arthritic fingers shaking so badly she could barely grip them properly. The simple task of unlocking her door became a monumental challenge while she remained hyper-aware of the perceived threat just yards away. Lisa's expression changed as she finally recognized the signs of genuine fear in her elderly neighbor's behavior. Her smile faded into concern and she immediately took a step backward, creating more distance between Wally and Margaret. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I didn't realize. Please don't be afraid. Wally is completely harmless, I promise you." But Margaret had already disappeared into her house, the door closing firmly behind her with the sound of multiple locks being engaged. She leaned against the door, breathing heavily and trying to calm her racing heart. The encounter had confirmed every fear she had harbored about having a pit bull living so close to her home. Even though the dog had remained calm during the brief interaction, Margaret was convinced that it was simply a matter of time before its true aggressive nature would emerge. From her living room window, Margaret watched as Lisa stood in her driveway for several minutes, apparently talking to her dog in low, soothing tones. The young woman looked genuinely upset by the encounter, frequently glancing toward Margaret's house with an expression of concern and regret. Eventually, Lisa led Wally into their backyard, disappearing from Margaret's view but leaving her with a lingering sense of unease about future encounters. That afternoon, Margaret found an envelope in her mailbox that hadn't been there during her morning retrieval. Her name was written on the front in neat feminine handwriting. Inside was a handwritten note from Lisa, apologizing for frightening her and explaining that Wally was indeed a certified therapy dog who worked with elderly patients at a local nursing home. The letter included several photographs of Wally interacting gently with senior citizens, his massive head resting peacefully in the laps of smiling residents. Margaret studied the photographs with confusion and skepticism. The images showed the same dog she had encountered that morning, but his demeanor in the pictures seemed completely different from the threatening presence she had perceived. In one photo, Wally was lying beside an elderly man in a wheelchair, the dog's expression patient and calm. Another picture showed him wearing a colorful therapy dog vest, surrounded by a group of nursing home residents, who were clearly delighted by his presence. The letter went on to explain that Lisa worked as a physical therapist and that Wally accompanied her to work 3 days a week as part of her facility's animal therapy program. Lisa wrote that she understood Margaret's concerns and wanted to assure her that Wally was extensively trained, certified, and had never shown any signs of aggression toward humans. She offered to provide references from the nursing home and Wally's training certifications if Margaret would like to see them. Despite the thoughtful letter and the compelling photographs, Margaret remained skeptical. She had read about pit bulls being unpredictable, and she reasoned that even the best-trained dog could potentially turn dangerous under the right circumstances. The letter did demonstrate that Lisa was a caring person, who was genuinely concerned about her neighbor's comfort, but it didn't address Margaret's fundamental fears about the breed itself. That evening, Margaret called Mrs. Henderson to discuss the encounter and the letter she had received. Mrs. Henderson listened sympathetically, but then shared her own observations about Wally over the past few weeks. "Margaret, I've watched that dog every day from my kitchen window," she said. "He's never barked aggressively, never shown any signs of meanness. Yesterday, a cat walked right through their yard and Wally just watched it peacefully. He didn't even get up from where he was lying." Margaret appreciated Mrs. Henderson's observations, but they did little to alleviate her concerns. She had spent too many years building up her fears about pit bulls to have them dispelled by a few positive encounters. In her mind, the dog's current calm behavior simply meant that the right trigger hadn't yet occurred. She remained convinced that it was only a matter of time before Wally would reveal his true, dangerous nature. The following morning brought another surprise. Margaret discovered a small gift basket on her front porch, containing homemade cookies, herbal tea, and another note from Lisa. This time the letter was shorter, but even more heartfelt. Lisa wrote that she didn't expect Margaret to overcome her fears immediately, but she wanted her elderly neighbor to know that both she and Wally were committed to being good. Respectful neighbors who would never intentionally cause anyone distress. Margaret brought the basket inside and sampled one of the cookies, which was delicious. The gesture touched her in a way she hadn't expected, and for the first time since Lisa and Wally had arrived, she began to consider that perhaps her new neighbor was genuinely trying to build a positive relationship, despite the challenging circumstances. However, her fear of Wally remained as strong as ever, creating an internal conflict between her growing appreciation for Lisa's kindness and her deep-seated terror of the dog. The morning that would change everything started like any other autumn day, with Margaret performing her ritual window surveillance before venturing outside. November had arrived with its characteristic chill, and she wrapped her heavy coat tightly around her frail frame as she prepared for her weekly journey to the mailbox. Lisa's car was absent from the driveway across the street, indicating she had already left for work, which should have meant the coast was clear for Margaret's brief outdoor expedition. However, fate had different plans. As Margaret made her way carefully down her front walkway, focusing on avoiding the patches of wet leaves that could cause a dangerous fall, she failed to notice that Lisa's car was actually parked on the side street, hidden from her usual vantage point. The young woman had stayed home that morning, due to a canceled appointment, and was working in her backyard with Wally, enjoying the crisp air and giving her dog some exercise. Margaret had just reached her mailbox and was sorting through the usual collection of bills and advertisements when she heard a sound that made her blood freeze. Behind her, coming from the direction of Lisa's house, was the unmistakable sound of a large dog moving through the fallen leaves. She turned slowly, her worst nightmare materializing before her eyes. Wally was approaching her across the street, having somehow gotten out of his backyard. The massive pit bull moved with purpose, but without any signs of aggression. His tail was wagging gently and his expression appeared curious rather than threatening. However, Margaret's terror-stricken mind could only process the fact that the animal she feared most was now advancing toward her, with nothing between them but the narrow residential street. Her legs felt weak, her heart began racing, and she realized with growing panic that she was too far from her front door to retreat to safety. Margaret tried to back away, but her arthritic hip chose that moment to seize up with a sharp pain that made her gasp audibly. The walking cane slipped from her suddenly numb fingers, clattering on the sidewalk as she struggled to maintain her balance. In that moment of vulnerability, she felt completely helpless and exposed, certain that she was about to become another statistic in the news stories she had read about pit bull attacks. Wally had now crossed the street and was approaching slowly, his brown eyes fixed on Margaret with what seemed like genuine concern. Instead of the aggressive behavior she expected, the dog's demeanor was gentle and deliberate. He moved closer until he was within arm's reach. then sat down calmly and looked up at her with an expression that seemed almost human in its empathy and understanding. Margaret stood frozen, afraid to move or even breathe too loudly, waiting for the attack she was certain would come. But instead of baring his teeth or showing any signs of aggression, Wally simply remained sitting peacefully beside her. His presence, rather than being threatening, seemed almost protective. The dog appeared to sense her distress and was responding with a calmness that contradicted everything Margaret had believed about his breed. "Wally," Lisa's voice called from across the street, filled with concern as she realized what had happened. She came running from her backyard, her face showing genuine worry about the situation. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Thompson. He must have pushed through the gate latch. He's never done that before." Lisa approached cautiously, not wanting to startle either Margaret or create any additional chaos in an already stressful situation. Margaret found her voice enough to whisper, "Please, please get him away from me." Her words came out in a barely audible plea, her entire body trembling with fear and the effort of remaining upright without her walking cane. She expected Lisa to quickly leash the dog and remove him from the situation, but what happened next surprised her completely. Instead of immediately calling Wally away, Lisa spoke to him in a calm, authoritative voice. "Wally, stay. Gentle." The dog's ears perked up at the commands, and he remained in his sitting position but shifted slightly closer to Margaret. To her amazement, Wally carefully picked up her dropped walking cane in his mouth and held it out toward her, his tail wagging slowly in what appeared to be an offering of help. Margaret stared in disbelief at the sight of this supposedly dangerous animal, attempting to return her mobility aid. The gesture was so unexpected and gentle that it momentarily broke through her wall of fear. She looked down into Wally's dark eyes and saw not the aggressive beast she had imagined, but an intelligent creature who seemed genuinely concerned about her well-being. "He's trying to help you," Lisa said softly, tears forming in her eyes as she witnessed this touching interaction. "Wally has been trained to assist people who have dropped items or need support. It's part of his therapy dog training. He can sense that you're in distress and he wants to help." With trembling hands, Margaret slowly reached out and took the walking cane from Wally's mouth. His teeth never made contact with her skin, and he released the cane gently as soon as she had a firm grip on it. The dog's mouth was soft and careful, showing a level of control and training that contradicted every assumption she had made about his nature. Once Margaret had her cane back, Wally moved slightly closer and positioned himself beside her in a way that provided additional support. His solid, warm presence actually helped steady her as she regained her balance and composure. The dog remained perfectly still, allowing her to use him as a living support system while she recovered from both her physical and emotional distress. "I can't believe this," Margaret whispered, more to herself than to Lisa. She was still afraid, but the fear was now mixed with confusion and wonder at the dog's behavior. Everything she thought she knew about pit bulls was being challenged by this gentle giant, who seemed more concerned with her welfare than with displaying any form of aggression. Lisa approached slowly, keeping her movements calm and non-threatening. "Mrs. Thompson, I know you're scared and I understand why, but Wally would never hurt anyone. He spent 3 years training for this kind of work. He can sense when someone needs help, and he responds with kindness every time." Margaret looked down at Wally, who was still sitting patiently beside her, his warm brown eyes looking up at her with what could only be described as compassion. For the first time since he had moved to the neighborhood, she saw him not as a monster from her nightmares, but as an individual being with his own personality and intentions. The realization was both overwhelming and strangely comforting. He really was trying to help me," Margaret said slowly, the words coming out as if she were testing their truth by speaking them aloud. The simple act of acknowledging Wally's good intentions felt like crossing a bridge she never thought she would be able to traverse. For the first time in decades, she was beginning to question whether her fears about pit bulls might be based on misconceptions rather than reality. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but the encounter at the mailbox had cracked open a door in Margaret's heart that she thought had been permanently sealed. Over the following days, she found herself watching Wally from her window, with curiosity rather than pure terror. She began to notice details she had missed before. The way his tail wagged when children walked by, how he sat patiently while Lisa worked in the garden, and his gentle demeanor during their evening walks around the neighborhood. Lisa, sensing the shift in Margaret's attitude, began making small gestures to build trust between her elderly neighbor and her beloved dog. She would wave when she saw Margaret at her window, and sometimes she would have Wally perform simple tricks in their front yard where Margaret could observe his obedience and training from a safe distance. The dog would sit, stay, and lie down on command, demonstrating the level of control and discipline that contradicted Margaret's preconceived notions about his breed. One afternoon, Margaret surprised herself by stepping onto her front porch when she saw Lisa and Wally returning from their walk. It was a small act of courage, but it felt monumental to someone who had spent weeks hiding behind curtains and locked doors. Lisa noticed immediately and offered a warm smile and a gentle wave, while Wally sat down in their driveway and looked toward Margaret with what appeared to be patient interest rather than any form of threat. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Lisa called out, keeping her voice light and non-threatening. She made no move to bring Wally closer to Margaret's property, respecting the invisible boundaries that the elderly woman had established. Instead, she simply allowed Margaret to observe them from her comfortable distance, letting her neighbor set the pace for any potential relationship development. Margaret found herself nodding in response, her first voluntary interaction with her neighbor since that terrifying morning encounter. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice carrying across the street. "It's quite lovely." The simple exchange felt like a victory for both women, a small step toward bridging the gap that fear had created between them. As the days passed, Margaret began to notice more positive behaviors from Wally that challenged her assumptions. She watched him interact with the neighborhood children who walked by on their way to school, observing how he remained calm and gentle even when they called his name or wanted to pet him. Lisa always supervised these interactions carefully, but Wally's responses were consistently patient and friendly. The breakthrough came on a particularly difficult day for Margaret. She had received news that her old friend Eleanor had passed away, leaving her feeling more isolated and lonely than ever. As she sat on her front porch, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, she didn't notice that Wally had noticed her distress from across the street. To her amazement, the dog approached slowly and deliberately, crossing the street with purpose but without any signs of aggression. Margaret's initial instinct was to retreat into her house, but something about Wally's demeanor stopped her. He moved with the same careful, measured steps he had used during their mailbox encounter, his body language communicating concern rather than threat. Wally stopped at the edge of Margaret's property and lay down on the grass, positioning himself where she could see him clearly, but at a distance that didn't feel invasive. He rested his large head on his paws and simply watched her with those expressive brown eyes, as if he understood that she needed companionship, but also needed to feel safe and in control of the situation. Margaret found herself talking to him, something she never thought she would do. "I lost a dear friend today," she said softly, more to herself than to the dog, but Wally's ears perked up at the sound of her voice. "Eleanor and I knew each other for over 50 years. I don't know what I'm going to do without her." Wally remained in his lying position but began to make a soft, comforting sound, not quite a whimper but a gentle vocalization that seemed to express empathy and understanding. The sound was so unexpected and touching that Margaret found herself crying even harder. But now her tears included a mixture of grief and wonder at this creature's apparent capacity for compassion. Lisa appeared a few minutes later, having noticed Wally's absence from their backyard. When she saw the scene, her dog lying peacefully at the edge of Margaret's property while the elderly woman sat crying on her porch, she understood immediately what was happening. Rather than calling Wally away, she sat down on her own front steps and waited quietly, allowing the natural therapy session to continue. "He knows you're sad," Lisa said gently, her voice carrying the short distance between their homes. "Wally has always been sensitive to people's emotions. At the nursing home where we work, he can identify the residents who are having difficult days before the staff even notices. He has this incredible gift for providing comfort when people need it most." Margaret looked at Wally through her tears and realized that she was no longer afraid of him. The fear that had dominated her thoughts for months had somehow been replaced by gratitude for his unexpected presence during one of her darkest moments. This dangerous beast she had imagined was actually a source of comfort, offering his silent companionship when she needed it most desperately. "Would it be all right if he came a little closer?" Lisa asked carefully, not wanting to push too hard but sensing that Margaret might be ready for the next step in their relationship. "He won't move unless you say it's okay, and I'll call him back immediately if you become uncomfortable. Margaret considered the question, her heart still heavy with grief but somehow lighter because of Wally's presence. Looking into his gentle eyes, she found herself nodding slowly. I think that would be okay, she whispered, surprising herself with her answer. Lisa gave Wally a subtle hand signal, and he rose slowly to his feet. He approached Margaret's porch with the same careful, deliberate movements she had witnessed before, stopping when he reached the bottom step and looking up at her with patient eyes, waiting for permission to come closer. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached out tentatively toward Wally, who remained perfectly still at the bottom of her porch steps. The moment her fingers made contact with his soft fur, something profound shifted inside her heart. The touch she had feared for so long was warm, gentle, and surprisingly comforting. Wally's tail wagged slowly, and he carefully rested his massive head against her knee, as if he understood the magnitude of trust she was offering him. "Oh my," Margaret whispered, her voice filled with wonder as she felt the steady rhythm of Wally's breathing and the solid warmth of his presence. "He's so gentle." Her fingers found themselves stroking his fur naturally, and she marveled at how soft and well-groomed he was. This was nothing like the aggressive, unpredictable creature she had imagined living across the street for all these months. Lisa watched from her porch with tears in her eyes, understanding that she was witnessing something truly special. She had seen Wally work his magic with many people over the years, but watching him help an elderly woman overcome decades of fear was particularly moving. The bond forming between Margaret and Wally was genuine and healing for both of them. Over the following weeks, the relationship between Margaret and Wally continued to develop in remarkable ways. What started as tentative porch visits evolved into daily interactions that brought joy and purpose back into Margaret's life. She began looking forward to seeing Wally each morning, and he seemed to sense her schedule, often positioning himself in his front yard around the time she typically ventured outside. Margaret found herself sharing stories with Wally about her late husband Edward, her friend Eleanor, and the loneliness that had consumed her life since their deaths. The dog listened with remarkable attention, his expressive eyes seeming to understand every word. Sometimes he would rest his head in her lap while she talked, providing a comfort she hadn't experienced since Edward's passing. Lisa gradually joined these conversations, and Margaret discovered that her young neighbor was not only kind and patient, but also remarkably wise for her age. Lisa shared stories about her work at the nursing home, describing how Wally had helped countless elderly residents find moments of joy and connection during their difficult journeys. Margaret began to understand that what she was experiencing was not unique. Wally had a special gift for healing hearts that had been touched by loss and loneliness. The transformation in Margaret's daily routine was dramatic. Her morning newspaper retrieval became an anticipated social event rather than a military operation. She would often linger on her porch, hoping to catch sight of Wally and Lisa starting their day. Her weekly grocery shopping expanded to include treats for Wally, and she found herself smiling as she selected items she thought he would enjoy. Margaret's daughter Sarah noticed the change immediately during their Sunday phone calls. Her mother's voice had a lightness that had been missing for months, and she spoke enthusiastically about her new neighbors and their remarkable dog. When Margaret mentioned that she was considering asking Lisa if Wally could visit her inside her home, Sarah was so shocked she nearly dropped the phone. "Mom, are you telling me you want to invite a pit bull into your house?" Sarah asked incredulously. "The same woman who used to cross the street to avoid chihuahuas?" Margaret laughed at her daughter's reaction, realizing how dramatically her perspective had changed. She explained how Wally had proven that individual character mattered far more than breed stereotypes, and how his presence had brought light back into her dark world. The first indoor visit was arranged carefully, with Lisa bringing Wally over for tea on a Saturday afternoon. Margaret had spent hours preparing, cleaning her house and arranging comfortable seating areas where Wally could rest. When they arrived, Wally entered her home with the same calm, respectful demeanor he displayed everywhere else, immediately lying down in a spot where he could see both women without being in their way. As they sat drinking tea and eating homemade cookies, Margaret marveled at how natural and peaceful the gathering felt. Wally remained quietly nearby, occasionally approaching when invited but never demanding attention or causing any disruption. His presence filled the house with a warmth and life that Margaret hadn't felt since Edward's death. The regular visits became a cherished part of Margaret's week, and eventually evolved into daily check-ins where Lisa would stop by before work with Wally for a few minutes of conversation and companionship. Margaret began accompanying them on short walks around the neighborhood, something she hadn't done in years. With Wally by her side, she felt safer and more confident than she had in decades. Margaret's story began to spread throughout the neighborhood and beyond. Mrs. Henderson shared it with friends at the community center, and Lisa's colleagues at the nursing home were amazed by the transformation their therapy dog had facilitated in his own neighborhood. Margaret found herself becoming an unlikely advocate for judging dogs as individuals rather than by their breed, sharing her experience with anyone who would listen. The elderly woman who had once lived in fear of pit bulls now spent her afternoons reading on her porch with Wally, resting peacefully beside her chair. She discovered that his presence not only provided companionship, but also gave her a sense of security she hadn't felt since Edward's death. Neighbors who had previously seemed distant began stopping to chat, drawn by the heartwarming sight of the unlikely pair. As winter approached, Margaret realized that her life had been completely transformed by a dog she had once considered her worst nightmare. Wally had taught her that fear often prevents us from experiencing the very things that could heal our hearts. She had learned that love and friendship can come from the most unexpected sources, and that sometimes the courage to trust again can lead to the most beautiful relationships. Margaret Thompson, who had spent months dreading the presence of a pit bull in her neighborhood, now couldn't imagine her life without Wally. He had not only helped her overcome her fears, but had also given her back her joy, her confidence, and her connection to the world around her. In rescuing her from her isolation and fear, Wally had proven that sometimes the best therapy comes with 4 legs, a wagging tail, and a heart full of unconditional love. The bond between the elderly woman and the gentle giant had become a neighborhood legend, inspiring others to look beyond their prejudices and preconceptions. Margaret's story served as a powerful reminder that healing, friendship, and second chances can come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the thing we fear most is exactly what we need to make us whole again.